I pottered around doing this and that, still getting used to the new look of the place, and couldn't help but feel some pride as I did. It felt like all the recent renovations I'd done had been leading up to this. Quinn, the merchant, had put the idea in my head. I was going to build an establishment that would one day be famous for serving the most delicious bread you'll ever eat, where stories of the bread's secret recipe was only one of the many tales shared by weary but eager travellers. I may be the only person around here for now, but the population of Fool's Landing totalled 16. That included myself, Nellie, Fish, Two-Bone, Poof and Udder, the cats Seville, Enin and Titan, and the 8 skeleton horses. I was burning through my stone bricks quickly and gave up waiting for the single furnace in the bunker to smelt more smooth stone, instead hauling down stacks of cobblestone to the kitchen. I still found myself feeling impatient and looked for a way to kill time. The great mouth of the chasm underneath my plateau swallowed the daylight and spat back out deep groans of zombies and the clacking of skeletons. Yet, the excitement of discovery beckoned me. I decided to bypass the proverbial front door of the chasm and crept through some of the natural tunnels on the surface of my plateau, to find a place to start a mine shaft, in the hope that it would emerge within the cave itself. I took so long on the mine, I need never have dirtied the farmhouse kitchen with the industrial smelting. As I pondered how the residue of smelting cobblestone would affect the food, I noticed that Nellie had the recipe for a baked potato. It was only then I realised that I'd misplaced my potato somewhere along the way. Frustratingly, I would have to take that off the tavern menu. I diverted a bit of time away from my current project to repair the smithy, which appeared to have burnt down. Even with an iron grate, wood and lava don't mix. I never really felt like I had the need to sleep. Only muscle aches and motivation stopped me from pressing forward. One night, whilst procrastinating, I refuged myself within the mine again, where I fortified it in preparation for extending it down into the earth at a later date. Aside from a route down into the chasm, the mine would be a good source of stone, which I currently had plenty of. My stores of wood, on the other hand, were less healthy, and I found the plains of the savannah to be a safer place at night than perching on top of a high wall. As I built, the undead skeleton horses plodded about the paddock, and I found it hard not to stare at them, or ignore their monstrous whinnying. I wasn't as resilient as Poof was in that regard. After spending a bit of time with them, I began to get to know them. There was Voma and Conker, who always went around sniffing anything they could. Palatine, who never stopped eating, or should I say, trying to eat. Phalanx, oddly dexterous for a horse. I thought she was going to open the gate at one point, and she managed to find a way to wander out of the holding pen I had temporarily added. Tibia and Talus, the highest jumpers of the herd. I had to ride all of them to find that out. And finally, Hamate and Lunate, who always seemed to want to lend a helping hand. Sometimes it was difficult to tell them apart, if you weren't watching their behaviour. After a week of building, the bar in the tavern was ready to be stocked with its first batch of milk, and I once again found myself proudly surveying my work. The Hoof and Udder, bakery and tavern. Though somewhat downtrodden at the loss of my potato, the real draw of the Hoof and Udder would be its bread, despite the name. I had been meticulously farming the crops in between building, and whilst a nice stockpile was beginning to form in the farmhouse kitchen, I wanted to expand production. I knew I wasn't much of an engineer, but I wanted to learn. I was hoping to plant a bed of crops with some element of automation, to save time and energy, allowing me to cater for more potential patrons. My current planting bed was inspired by the fools at the Grumpy Village, where I thought to utilise the properties of water to act as a transport mechanism. Thinking back to what I'd seen in the Grumpy Village, I realised there were other properties of water that I could exploit. Whilst water would flatten any crops growing on tilled soil, it wouldn't affect the fertility of the dirt. I was excavating within the foundations of my budding crop tower when I saw that guests had paid me a visit, confirmed by the vision of their name. The Enderman looked around at what I was working on, so I explained. I wasn't sure if Guest understood me when I talked, but my enthusiasm was unaffected, when something peculiar happened. My mind reeled into another Ender vision, except it was me who was communicating. It seemed that Guest was just as shocked as I was, because he zoomed away once we had both regained our senses. I didn't have a clue how I'd done it, but the vision of bread was one I was used to seeing, thanks to Guest himself. Perhaps that, coupled with my eagerness, allowed me to communicate on the Enderman's level. I checked in the farmhouse kitchen, where Guest frequented fish, but they weren't there. After a quick look around, I had almost given up, when I found them in the barn. Guest was deeply surveying the herd of skeleton horses. My unpracticed new ability to communicate back to Guest in the tongue of the Enderman may have given the impression I was more confident with Ender visions than I really was, because the vision of the horses Guest showed me was complicated. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't summon another vision to communicate back. Something about one part of the vision seemed somewhat familiar and eerie, but Guest's light touch soothed my fleeting worries. With that, I left Guest to investigate the skeletal steeds. The ghastly flying creatures, Abranis had called phantoms, were circling above me, but it seemed like something was warding them off. At first I thought it might have been the skeleton horses, which wouldn't have surprised me. But as I was finishing excavating the foundations, I realised it was the cats hissing that drove them away, just like creepers. Enin was appreciative to finally get the recognition for his duty. Building the crop tower to allow the water to freely flow across all the crops, whilst avoiding the staircase, and also having the staircase in arm's reach of the crops, with a second piece of plumbing needed to supply the crops with water, was more difficult than I thought. But after some, or rather a lot of tinkering, I figured it out. After almost another whole week of toiling without sleep, I finally decided to get some shut-eye. The cats gifted me with some chicken meat and another rabbit pelt, clearly very grateful to get some rest. Now I had two. I finished fitting a copper basin on the roof of the crop tower to catch the rain, and when it was full, I would release the water down spiralling mounds of dirt. That was my plan anyway, if the piston I had my eye on worked the way I thought it would, and Ellie gave me no reason to think it wouldn't. My plans were dashed, however, when I realised that I'd used the very last of my redstone I'd found in Copperwater Cave dungeon to make the forge. With my plans temporarily shattered, I resigned to fitting the exterior with lanterns. At least the non-functional crop tower would look slightly more impressive that way. But even that I couldn't immediately do, as my reserves of iron were expended, as was my copper. That and the considerable investment of stone and coal had sunk into the crop tower had left me with a few shortages. Luckily, the bountiful plateau had iron close to hand. I hope the crop tower pays off. I took a moment to breathe in my bunker, clearing the feeling of frustration that was welling inside me, when I was interrupted by a gruff shout. Outside my door was a band of raiders. I was stunned by their appearance and didn't answer at first when they shouted through the door to come out. When I had wished for visitors, this is not what I had meant. In my silence, they threatened Two-Bone and the cats. I shouted back out the bars at them, asking what they wanted. The biggest of them said they had been robbed, and they're getting it in this direction. I adamantly refuted the accusation that I was said perpetrator, but the hostile visitors weren't having it. They told me if I wanted them to leave, I'd have to give them back what I'd taken. Who could have robbed them? I asked. Who robbed you? Nice try, the little one said. You're lying. Another voice agreed. Yeah, I saw him ride away in one of those things. Do you think they're dangerous? They must be talking about the skeleton horses. The others stopped speaking when the gruff voice spoke. We will settle for 100 emeralds. Part of me was flattered that my home gave the impression of affluence, before considering that I could have been a defenceless villager in a hut and they'd still be extorting me. There probably was no robbery. The gruff voice raised again. If you don't come out right now, we'll pelt these animals with our crossbows until they're no more than pelts themselves. Okay, just stop. I keep my valuables in the basement. Hold on. You have 1 minute before we gut the yellow one. I grabbed the saddle from my chest as quietly as I could and went downstairs, followed by the zooming animals, who I greeted with a knowing look. The startled cries of the raiders could be heard above, but only faintly in the tunnel. I spared a glance at 2 of the skeleton horses, who were enjoying the waters of their trough, before mounting the closest horse to me. Together, we stepped atop the plateau to face the raiders, and I soon found that I was atop Talus, whose hooves sailed over the heads of the aggressors as he leapt in a whirlwind of clattering bones. It was a shame that the bandits didn't fancy a drink, as people of all shapes and sizes were welcome at the Hoof and Udder, so long as they don't cause trouble. Maybe people will say that it's guarded by a stampede of undead horses, but judging how much they intimidated even the raiders, perhaps I should try and keep a low profile for them. I thought about that as I helped Voma and Conker out of the water trough, both of whom had got stuck investigating it with their nose. Although they didn't seem to mind being almost completely submerged. I saddled up Talus for the trip ahead. The iron horse armour I'd also found in Copperwater Cave's dungeon didn't fit the skeleton horse, so I couldn't use that to hide his appearance. I'd just have to keep him out of sight of the villagers. I grabbed the enchanted book I'd fished up at the gravelly cliff to see if Gloria and old Carlton knew what it meant. After spending some time with Nellie in the kitchen, we had a stack of the Hoof and Udder's signature bread. Then it was time to say farewell to those who were staying at Fool's Landing, including the cats. Two-Bone, Talus and I would have to deal with the creepers and phantoms ourselves. And with that, we were off. So the maths I did on the sign-off for the last chapter were wrong. I calculated for 3 consecutive lightning strikes, not the whole storm, and I've got no idea how many times lightning struck in the actual storm. Hoof wanted to go on an adventure of her own this week, so maybe I'll have to bring her along one day. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed.